Welcome back to Chess Openings Explained. Due to current conditions here in St. Louis, we're going to have to pre-record this lecture, but hopefully you guys will still enjoy it. The last time we looked at the Chigorin, we looked at early captures on d5, and now we're going to look at some other options. So here, this is just a little reminder of what we covered. d4, d5, c4, knight c6. This is the Chigorin Defense. And after this move, we covered what happens if white takes with the pawn. But this week, we are actually going to be looking at what happens if white ends up playing knight f3 in this position. And also what happens if they play knight c3 in this position. So we'll start with knight to f3. I also want to mention that white also has this move e3, and this is playable, but it's not too ambitious. And the problem with this is that after move 2, black already has a lead in development, and that means that any inaccuracy white makes can be punished more severely because they have that extra piece in the game. So I'm not a big fan of e3, but I do want to mention it is playable. Now, we have knight f3 here, and the main move by black is bishop to g4. After bishop to g4, white can continue with knight to c3, and I think they should. The other options they have is, I guess the other main option is queen a4, which is a sideline black should be aware of. We'll touch on this in just a second, but there's also takes right away. And the problem with capturing early is going to be the same problem we had in the capture on move 3, is that white gets the bishop pair, but black is usually ahead in piece activity, and it's the positions are not the most familiar for white. So after takes, then bishop takes, and then g takes. And the argument for white's wrecked pawn structure here, with all these doubled pawns, is that they have the bishop pair. But after takes e3 and e5, this can lead to some complications that white doesn't necessarily need to get into. But go check out part 1 if you want to see some more of this imbalance. Instead, if you're wanting to avoid the main line, after knight c3, or rather not after knight c3, is just right away queen a4. And this sideline, black should take on f3, focusing on quick development and intending to follow up with a quick bishop to b4 check, trying to get white to block with the knight and then trade off that bishop for that knight as well. So this has some interesting ideas after g takes, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, and then we get the trade on c3 eventually. And again, a bit of a messy pawn structure for white, but you do have the bishop pair, and black can continue with pretty natural moves such as knight e7 after rook b1 hitting the pawn, rook b8, and then h4 grabbing space. And from here, I suggest looking at the game Maleniuk versus Morozovic in 1994. But the main move here is knight c3, my recommendation. And after knight c3, black has two options. They can capture on f3, and if they do so, here you can still take with the g-pawn, but the line I looked at was e takes f3, and after black goes e6, you can trade on d5 here, and then bishop to b5, and white does have a pretty nice edge here. Queen b3 is a nice move to follow, castle kingside, and the bishop is probably going to go to f4. If black doesn't take on f3 and instead they play the main move e6, white has two questions. Where should this bishop on c1 develop to? Should it go to f4 or should it go to g5? And should you trade on d5? And if so, should you trade before you develop the bishop, or should you trade after you develop the bishop? So we will look at all of these different options here, and we will start with looking at actually a move a viewer asked about, pawn to c5, shutting down the queen side here. And I don't recommend this. Black can just trade on f3, and after you recapture a6, and I don't see how c5 has benefited to your position. You can go bishop e3, reinforcing d4, bishop e7, bishop to d3. And after knight f6, castles, castles, I don't think black has any problems here. Maybe knight d7 and b6 to chip away at this c5 pawn, maybe even b6 right away. But I don't think white has done anything to hurt black's position here. But back to the two main questions. Do you go bishop g5 or bishop f4? So we'll look at bishop g5. And after bishop g5, bishop e7. And you can capture on d5 first. If they end up capturing on g5, you can capture on c6, and material will work itself out after bishop f3, gf3, takes on c6. Black does have these double isolated pawns, and white does have queen a4 coming up, hitting this weak c6 pawn. So black does better just to take back right away, and here after takes on e7, knight takes e7, after e3, this leads to some positions that can be similar to the Queen's Gambit accepted, where white just has these two knights out and will have some rather easy development. So bishop g5, definitely playable. Your other option here is going bishop f4. And after bishop f4, there's two moves I want to talk about. First, the mistake. Bishop to b4. This move can be met with knight to e5, getting the knight off of f3 where it can be captured, so you're eliminating the risk of doubling your pawns. And then after knight captures and bishop captures, if black decides to capture on c3 and we take back, they can hit our bishop, we just retreat, and after knight e7, this is starting to be a little reminiscent of a Nimzo Indian. After queen b3, b6, and f3, this is really starting to look like an f3 Nimzo here after e4. And I think that this is going to be completely fine for white. The pawns on the light squares are doing a good job balancing out this light square bishop, and this knight really doesn't have any influence over our position as a whole, so our dark squared bishop I think is better. And this should be a fairly comfortable position for white. Black's main option is to capture on f3, g takes f3, bishop to b4, and now e3. And I want to clarify, this is the entire point of capturing with the g-pawn, is so you can go e3 and build a solid pawn chain. You don't want to capture with the e-pawn and then have a weak d4 pawn. But okay, e3, knight e7, a3, takes, and castles. And here, white has the bishop pair with this awkward pawn structure that we should be pretty familiar with now. But this structure is not quite as open as some of the other positions here. And after castles, bishop to g3, this is avoiding knight g6 coming with tempo on the bishop. And it's also a bit of a waiting move to see what black is going to do. But from here, you might be looking at capturing on d5 like normal. Queen b3 is always an option. Rook b1 to pressure the pawn over here. Bishop d3, all these natural moves. White does kind of have the luxury of waiting to see what black does. So that's what you get with bishop f4. But my recommendation here is actually to capture first. And the point is that if black captures back right away, now you have bishop f4. And also over time, this system has kind of emerged as the main line. You also have bishop g5 here, but because of the amount of content and our time restraints, I'm not going to cover bishop g5 in this position because I believe bishop f4 is better. And black's best move to meet bishop f4 is bishop d6. Black needs to develop, keep up in pace with white, and one of the ways he can do that is by challenging this undefended piece right away. There's also knight f6, which is a little dubious, but after e3, bishop b4, black's had worse positions here. And while there aren't really any concrete reasons why this is worse, an example line goes as follows, where after these queens develop in white castles, capture on c3, g5, hitting the bishop goes back and castles long. White does have a bit more flexible of a pawn structure here. As you can see, these pawns are kind of scattered, not really working together, and the pieces aren't well coordinated, no real clear targets. Whereas with white, you just bring the rooks over to b1. I think either rook, but I suggest the a rook. And from here, I recommend looking at the game Bars versus Guizar from, what is it, 2011. This is a correspondence game between two 2100s, or sorry, a 2100 and a 2300 that ended in a draw. So let's see here. Instead of knight f6, black should just go bishop d6, try and trade off the bishops. And here, white should just drop the bishop back. There's no need to take and let the queen take back, and now black is ready to long castle. You can just drop back to g3, and black needs to spend another move to try and get his king to safety. So now a couple more options. You can try knight f6 here, and after e3, castles bishop h4. This is avoiding them taking and doubling our pawns, which honestly, that's not even a real problem. It would open your rook up. But this does introduce a rather annoying pin, and now white is putting pressure on black's center. So knight f6 a little dubious because of this bishop h4 idea that you don't see in many other lines. And now you also have bishop takes f3 here, which is always an idea black has. Just trade the bishop off for the knight. White always captures with the g-pawn. Now knight g e7, and now e3. And this is a position that can be reached if black captures on f3 before bishop d6. But with this move order, white doesn't have the option of queen to d2 at any point. And trading on f3 also isn't mandatory, and black does have some positions that are more ambitious, such as knight g to e7 before trading. After knight g to e7, you get e3, and now if black captures f3, white can recapture with the queen, and this is fine. But black can castle, bishop e2 breaking the pin, now a6, castles kingside. Now we get bishop g3 because white has committed to the king side. Now if white captures with the h-pawn, the rook is not opening up on the h-file here. So you're not introducing any risk to black's king side. And now queen d6, and I think this position is very, I don't know if balanced is the right word, but equal. Both sides definitely have chances here. And really only black has had good results from this position according to my database, although engines do give white a plus. This is a very nice position for both sides. Black has a lot of attacking chances, but if white can survive, then the space and I guess, yeah, really the space and more flexibility to develop the pieces is going to prevail. All right. In addition to this knight f3 line, there is also knight c3, and I really think this is the absolute best try for white against the Chigorin. There is d4, d5, c4, knight to c6, and now again, instead of capturing, instead of playing knight to f3, you go knight to c3. And here, there's a little bit more flexibility. Part of it is that white does retain f3, so you can kick a bishop if it ever comes to g4. Really, there's no reason for black to put the bishop on g4 if the knight is not on f3 yet. And there's a couple problems here black can face if they continue with normal-looking moves. For example, e6. After e6, black is already going to suffer long-term problems with the lack of development of the bishop on c8. You are trapping it inside your pawn chain. And the knight on c6 really doesn't have much influence other than pressure on d4. So natural moves are good enough for white in this position. You can simply play e3 and develop your pieces like normal. And because this knight's blocking the c-pawn, it's going to be very awkward for black to find an advantage. There's also e5 instead of e6, and typically black suffers in this line after c takes, and after knight takes d4, e3 hitting the knight right away, so the knight has to go to f5. There's no other safe square. You have knight f3 putting pressure on e5, bishop d6 defending, and now bishop to b5 check. This induces bishop d7 blocking and a trade. And after e4, knight fe7, we see that black's knights are not the happiest pieces on the board. There's no clear breakthroughs for black, and it's not entirely clear what side they should be castling on. If they try castling on the queen side, well, we already have a bunch of space on the queen side. We'll be ready to bring our pieces in with queen b3 and bishop to e3, pointing directly at the king. And if black's going to try and castle king side, then after knight f6 and castles king side, there's going to be a bit of congestion over here for black. So e5, not the best move, in my opinion. Now, the other option black has is knight f6, which is playable, kind of reminiscent of a two knights tango. But there are a couple problems with the natural play. So here it just takes on d5, knight f3, and some of the natural moves here, like developing this light square bishop, can lead to some problems. For example, bishop to f5 actually runs into queen b3. And how exactly are you going to be saving your pawn and your knight? Well, if you try knight b6, well, here d5 is going to come in, and after knight b8, white just has all the space in the world, and e4 can actually be played right away, hitting the bishop. Bishop has to go back. Black has made no progress in developing their pieces, so bishop f5 is a problem because of queen b3. The other try black has is e6, saying, hey, if you take my pawn, it's poison. And here it actually is because of knight d to b4. And you're kind of trapping the queen here. There's no safe space on a6. And they're also threatening knight to c2. So this is actually a big mistake by white if they take this pawn. But instead, the very natural pawn to e4, just forking the pieces. And if black takes the knight, you take the bishop, and this is the point, that this knight is under attack. You've made no concessions to your center. The knight goes back to d5, and now you can either take on e6 or continue development with bishop d2, but white enjoys a very comfortable position here with lots of space, and black is not awkwardly placed, but they're really not doing anything for his position here, again, other than pressuring d4. So there can be problems. Now, what is black's best response? Well, white has taken this move knight c3 that doesn't protect c4. Black can just take this pawn. Now, white will normally go d5. There's also knight f3, and white will normally play this line if, well, actually I should go through the line. But we have knight f6, e4, bishop g4, bishop e3, just defending everything. e6, bishop takes c4, and this is really reminding me of a queen's gambit accepted here, really. After bishop b4, queen c2, castles rook d1. This is a really safe choice for white, and should be manageable for black, but this is pretty much what it's going to turn into if you play knight f3 here. Instead, just go d5, hit the knight. The knight really doesn't have many great moves. The only one that really lets it develop further is e5. And now you have f4 by white. So this can be why some people don't want to play this line, because f4 is definitely not a go-to move. It's not your first instinct. It seems like something, you know, a pure beginner would play, saying, oh, I'm just attacking your knight, and I hope you're going to leave it. I can take it. But now we have knight d7. And we have some very interesting moves. We have more moves like this that don't necessarily make 100% of sense the first you look at them, and are kind of computer-esque. But every knight retreat pretty much leads to problems. So knight g4 runs into e4. Now you're starting to look at what looks like a 4 pawns attack in the Alekhine. And after e5, knight f3, you're not running into any problems if black takes. It actually helps white's development. You have bishop c5, h3 hitting the knight, knight e3. This is the point of bishop c5. But you just trade the bishop and take the pawn. And after knight e7, bishop takes c4. White is doing just fine. All the space in the world, and they're up a pawn, so no problems. If the knight goes to g6, again, e4, just stake that claim in the center. Now black normally challenges with e6. You can actually trade, and then this endgame is actually very good for white. Mainly because of not an extra pawn. The pawns are equal here, but this big development with the bishop on c4, the knight on c3. This bishop's going to e3 soon, knight f3. Very, very easy, natural development for white. Don't have to think too hard with a space advantage. So after f4, the knight will normally retreat to d7, where, yet again, white plays e4, grabs this space in the center, and we're met with knight b6. Just getting out of the way of the bishop, so the bishop can develop, kind of securing our pawn on c4 here. And white's play is going to be very direct. They play a4, looking to play a5. That way they can take on c4. And the only way for black to stop this is to play a5 themselves. And this comes with a positional drawback. This is a very nice looking outpost for our knight in the future, if this c-pawn ever pushes. But white does need to focus on the rest of their development. They can't focus on having one beautiful knight and no other pieces to help it out. So that's why we see bishop e3 here. And after e6, looking to develop further, we see this take on b6, take on b6, and this secures this outpost for our knight. Bishop c4, we regain our pawn, and bishop to b4, so pinning the knight. So unfortunately, we won't be able to go right away. We have bishop b5 check, and king f8. If black tries to block with the bishop, this can run into some problems after pawn takes, because now this bishop is pinned. It can no longer capture, and the only way to maintain material equality is to recapture with your f-pawn, and now queen h5. And this is definitely looking pretty scary. Pretty scary for black. So blocking with the bishop isn't good. You just go king f8. Now you take on e6. Bishop takes, and f5, hitting the bishop. So you see black's development, really all those pieces are being awkwardly pushed around by white's pawns here. I guess the only unnatural thing is how far these pawns have moved and the king is not castled. But you'll notice black's development is just so uncoordinated with very little targets for white that there's no problems. Takes on d1, rook takes, and bishop to b3, hitting the rook. You can also ask yourself what happens if black ever takes this knight, but after this pawn recaptures, this is going to turn into a very strong structure for white, because now you have these two pawns stopping black's three. There's no way for them to make progress, and white can focus on pushing down the board here. So, no problems here. Bishop b3, rook d2, and g6. After g6, white just finishes his development with knight g to e2. And then after g takes f5, knight d4. Forking the pawn and the bishop. And now if bishop e6, you can retake with the pawn. You'll get your pawn back. And bishop d5. And white still has a very healthy advantage here. You can even take the bishop. They take your rook. You take. And after rook d8, you will lose a knight, but there is bishop c4 protecting. And knight to e7 is going to finish black's development here. And the only way white is better is if they trade. Rook takes d4. King c3 to protect the bishop. Rook c4, king e7. And now you have this rook endgame, which this is not an endings class. This is an openings class. I'm going to leave this one here. But I believe this is probably white's best try in the Chigorin, and if I had to choose a side in this endgame, it's going to be white. Black really doesn't have any progress to be made on the queen side here, and it's a 3-on-2 on the other side. I find it very hard for black to generate the chances on the king side of the board. But there it is. There is the rest of the Chigorin Defense. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know this is shorter. If there are any questions about move orders, please drop them down in the comments section below. I'm going to do my best to make sure I go through them and give you guys the answers you want. But there it is. I'll see you next time.